History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 20, Section 2, the Feminist Movement. So, we're going to start by talking about what feminism is. And feminism is the belief that men and women should be equal. The idea that it's not just equal socially, but it's politically and economically. And some of this goes back many, many years, even before even your textbook is focusing primarily on World War II. But you could go back to the time uh, before even the American Civil War, kind of the start of the abolitionist movement. And the fact that many of these people who were some of the most vocal abolitionists were women. Eventually, their battle is going to lead to the end of slavery, and eventually their battle is going to be for fighting for suffrage rights. When we talk about World War II, though, how did that war provide women a greater opportunity in the workforce? A lot of this comes from the fact that we had a draft going on, and a lot of men were being basically put into the military to fight the Japanese and the Nazis. So during the war, a lot of women took the place of men in the workforce. Roughly 8 million women had gone to work during the Second World War. And when the war ends, um, a lot of these women go back to being mothers and housewives. But for some reason, there are some women that um, really have a desire to kind of stay in the workplace. And really, in the 1950s, the number of women who held jobs outside of the home had actually increased. So, in number three, what were some signs of unequal status of women in the 1960s? And part of that was the fact that if you were looking for a job, the want ads that were posted in the newspapers were actually separated by gender. Sometimes we used to call them pink collar jobs. These are jobs that were kind of like relegated to women. So, for the most part, we could be looking at clerical work, maybe domestic labor, meaning cleaning houses and things like that. For the most part, that was all kind of within those pink collar job categories. Also, certain clubs and banks refused to do business with women. Women were also paid less, and for the most part, they were paid less even after we had legislation that was supposed to protect that right. So, in 1960, during the 1960s, our president, who was at that time John F. Kennedy, actually headed up a group of people that he wanted to see together as the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. And he selected no other than Eleanor Roosevelt to be their chairperson. And during their work, they basically did a lot of research, and they reported that on a lot of the troubles that women were having in the workplace. They created a network of some of the first feminist activists, and eventually they were able to lobby Congress. And in 1963, they were able to get together and pass what is called the Equal Pay Act. This basically outlawed that you can pay men more than you can pay women. Even though this law went into effect in 1963, getting businesses to recognize that they can't pay men more than women was a fight that lasted for many, many years, and in some cases is still going on to this day. Um, Along with some of these early feminists, we've got to talk about Betty Friedan. And so the question is who was Betty Friedan? Betty Friedan was an author, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. This is a book that came out in 1963. And if you kind of know a little bit about Betty Friedan, she had been a graduate of Smith College, which is kind of like the equivalent of Harvard, except for women. Um, And she, after graduating in the early 1940s, became a mom and a housewife. And as a result of that time being at home, she was really kind of discontented. Didn't want to be a stay at home mom. And so she took up this idea of interviewing women around the country. And this all became part of what is known as the feminine mystique. Within the book itself, it's basically talking about how women, even though they have it all, were still somewhat unfulfilled. She also became one of the founders of the National Organization for Women, known as NOW, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. How did the 1964 Civil Rights Act protect women's rights? Well, this act, particularly Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 64, outlawed job discrimination on the basis of gender. So, for the most part, you can't discriminate under this Civil Rights Act based on a lot of different things. Gender is just part of it, but race and color, your religion, your national origin, any of those kind of things you cannot discriminate against. And there was a group known as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that really was kind of entitled to make sure that businesses and agencies were kind of following the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But in 1965, they actually ruled that gender specific help wanted ads were actually legal. So in some cases, we're getting some changes, but yet there are still walls that still need to come down in this fight. So going back to Betty Friedan, what was described by Betty Friedan as the purpose of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, and that was to confront the conditions which denied women equal opportunity and freedom of choice. Um, NOW was formed in the year 1966. They had their first conference that year, and they had roughly 300 men and women that attended. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to aid women in the workplace by denouncing exclusions from certain occupations. They fought the unequal pay issue. But one of the big things that they wanted was a constitutional amendment, sometimes known as the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment. And eventually, they're going to make some headway on this. By 1972, the ball is rolling, and we have this amendment that's going to be before Congress, and actually, Congress is going to vote for it. But getting it ratified is going to be another story. So, who was Gloria Steinem? Gloria Steinem was an author and editor of a publication known as Ms. Magazine, and was certainly one of the uh, bigger supporters of NOW. So, going back to talking about the ERA, why were some women opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment? Well, just so you know, the ERA, for the most part, basically specified that equality, basically under the law, shall not be denied nor abided by the U.S. or any state on the count of a person's gender. To get an amendment passed, you need to have the support of at least 38 states. That would be basically three-quarters of all the states in our nation. It usually is within a frame of roughly 10 years that you would have to get that amendment on, basically passed by all the states. By 1977, about 35 states had actually ratified this amendment, three shy of what was needed to have the 38 that would have actually added it to the Constitution. But kind of leading into the late 70s, there's going to be some opposition. And actually, the woman that you see here on the left hand side, Phyllis Schlafly, was actually the individual who kind of rallied up this opposition group. So, why did some women oppose the ERA? They believed that it would take away traditional rights. Women could be drafted, but along with that, there were some other issues. It might take away the right to have a single gender college. and maybe even single gender high schools. This would apply both to men and women. It would eliminate some laws that actually protected women in the workplace. Obviously, when we talk about traditional rights, issues about alimony and divorce would be, in question, and maybe even issues about how we define the roles of both men and women would also be questioned. There are a lot of people that said that, um, the whole protection of marriage kind of came under this amendment, and certainly uh, Phyllis was one of these individuals who was trying to maybe get people to start thinking about that. She had a lot of support among conservatives. So, what was one of the notable achievements of the women's movement? And one of those was actually securing greater equality for women in education. And this next area that we're going to talk about probably has impacted more women than we could probably think of. Um, in 1972, under the educational amendments, there was something known as Title IX. And Title IX basically prohibited federally funded schools, that would be any kind of public school or any kind of school that is taking on federal funds, from discriminating against women in its operations. This would include everything from how you admit women into your programs, but also, more importantly, athletics. So, for every male sport that, let's say, a college or university offers, they have to have um, something that is comparable for women. So if you have boys basketball, you've got to have girls basketball. If you have football, perhaps maybe you have volleyball, and so on and so on. In some cases, it actually meant that some colleges had to eliminate certain sports programs so that it would be equal. For example, the University of Nebraska used to have a diving team for the men, but it was eliminated because the university was not offering enough women's athletic programs. So by cutting that program, it kind of put everything into balance. Needless to say, this all stemmed out of a case that came out of St. Paul, Minnesota in 1971, where a young lady qualified for the men's swim team, but because of the fact that there were questions about whether women in the state of Minnesota were allowed to participate in that sport, eventually this leads to her family bringing up a lawsuit so that their daughter could participate. Number 13. How was abortion regulated before 1973? And a lot of this goes back to individual states. Many states had actually had a ban on abortion, but with the passage of Roe versus Wade, this changes everything. Basically, Roe versus Wade states that state governments could not regulate abortion during the first 3 months or the first trimester of pregnancy. This is said to be within what they call the women's constitutional right to privacy, which supposedly is protected under the Ninth Amendment. So, what Supreme Court ruling legalized abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy? That would be Roe v. Wade. What's interesting is as pregnancy goes on under Roe v. Wade, um, the protections change. So during the second trimester, states could impose certain regulations. But when we look at third trimester abortions, states could ban those abortions with the exception of maybe a medical emergency. So, as a result of this decision, which was obviously very controversial and not necessarily one that appealed to a lot of people, this gave rise to the pro-life movement. And for the most part, ever since then, there have been challenges. For exception, in 1992, we had the Supreme Court case known as Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And that basically said that states could place some restrictions on all abortions, such as requiring doctors to explain the risk, to require patients to give informed consent, maybe requiring underage females to inform their parents before they could obtain an abortion. Some cases today even require states to use ultrasounds and to show the ultrasounds to that individual who is considering an abortion. Needless to say, that is all legal. And certainly that is maybe changing how we look at that original decision from 1973. Number 15, what educational and professional changes have occurred since the women's movement? One of the things that we're seeing is that there are now more women enrolled in college and they're pursuing college degrees and careers outside of the home. The number of two career families, meaning that both husband and wife holding down occupations, are probably far more common today than they ever have been. Employers are also becoming a little more flexible when we talk about women in the workplace by offering flexible hours and on site daycare, maybe even job sharing options as well. So, where have women made the most dramatic gains? And this is actually in certain professional occupations. When we talk about careers in medicine and law, this is where women are shining right now. In 2000, women made up more than 40% of the nation's grads graduating from medical school and law school. So, certainly things are improving, but there are still gaps yet to this day. Thank you very much.